Good morning, folks. Thank you all for dropping by electronically for the South Carolina Confederate Relic Room and Military Museum's History at Home talk today. It's a pleasure to have you all here, and we do appreciate your investing a little time with us. And you can see behind me today at the rifle range is training the members of the South Carolina National Guard Regiment, which is soon going to be the 118th Infantry in the American Expeditionary Force in World War I. So we're going to spend a little bit of time with these guys and their record today. I think it's well worth doing. We just went through Memorial Day weekend. I hope everyone found their own ways to do their own observance that day. And the Great War is often overlooked. It is not as prominent in our consciousness as the terrible war in the 1860s between the North and the South, or as World War II that sort of dominates the public consciousness in some ways. But a significant number to me when we think about American involvement in that First World War. Well, in the 1860s, South Carolina put more than 63,000 men into Confederate service. More than 63,000. That was a full mobilization for the state. But while that's pretty well known, in the First World War, South Carolina again put more than 64,000 men into uniform. Now, thankfully, losses were much lower. Many of those men never had to go overseas at all. And with the institution of slavery being ended, now a larger part of the population was being drawn on too. Still, 64,000 men. And among these soldiers would be some of the most distinguished and significant in the final campaign of World War I. And we're going to spend a little bit of time with those guys today. Specifically, we're looking at the record of the 118th Infantry. And I like to tell you all what sources I'm relying on so you can go off to your libraries and get a little bit deeper into it. Remember that the best history can be on a video screen. The best it can do is to be a good commercial for good history books. That's my comment about any documentary, no matter how apparently high quality, and about any Hollywood movie, no matter how apparently sensationalized and absurd, allow it to be a commercial for good history books. So there's a lot to read about the 118th Regiment, but usually in published histories of its division, the 30th Division. And today I'm going to be relying pretty heavily on some unpublished sources, or not unpublished, but not as readily available, particularly the history of the 118th Infantry, prepared by Lieutenant Sam Royal upon the return of the regiment from the war and published by the State Newspaper Corporation after they got back. But I do highly recommend the book Borrowed Soldiers, and you'll see the significance of that title a little bit later. And when we get to the meat of today's topic and we talk about the Medal of Honor recipients from the 118th Infantry, a good exercise to do, a good sort of mental and even spiritual exercise, for it induces humility. A good memorial exercise to do is to go to the Army Center for Military History's website, where all of the Medal of Honor citations for all of the services during all of our conflicts are there full text where you can scroll through them and read them. And if there's a better path to humility than reading Medal of Honor citations, I'm not sure exactly what that path would be. But we'll deal with the citations of members of this regiment today. Welcome aboard. We have another person at home joining, and again, thank you for the time you spend with us today. So my chosen background image today involving rifle marksmanship and the earlier history of the 118th. For those of you who were able to listen to our Mexican punitive expedition talk, Palmettos and Cactuses, the men who are going to be one of the most elite regiments on the Western Front in the fall of 1918 are the same guys who had spent a year blocking the border against Pancho Villa. And that was an exercise, that was a deployment that was a real test for them of their morale, of their learning curve. It honed their skills. They learned a lot that had not necessarily been driven home while drilling at home in their National Guard armories. One little anecdote that I bumped into was simply had to do with the Sumter Light Infantry, and our museum has an extensive collection of the items of Captain Robert Brown of the Sumter Light Infantry. He goes down to the border in command of that company and is later at the regiment we look at today, the 118th. He's going to be the supply officer of that regiment all the way through. And it was just revealing to me when I bumped into his name looking at the Adjutant General's report for that year. Because these men who went down to the Mexican border, they'd served together for a year. They'd been under pretty harsh field conditions. They'd dealt with discipline problems. They'd had some genuine military achievements in their mission, but it wasn't a very glorious mission. And then the Adjutant General's inspector came at the end of the year to these units returned home to South Carolina, and he put some derogatory comments about Captain Brown in the annual report to the Adjutant General. And I think the derogatory comments are very revealing, because what he said was that this was a group of very capable men. They seemed to be a pretty high quality unit, and yet there was something lacking in the leadership because everything was too informal. In fact, Captain Brown actually addressed some of the men by their first names. Well, heaven forbid, these guys have been on the border together for a year, and these guys are all neighbors back home in Sumter. They go to the same hardware store, they plant the same crops, they deal with the same difficulties, their families are intermingled through churches and marriages and social events. And some martinet from the Adjutant General's department is upset that they're not putting on a show for him. And as a former guardsman myself, I always, and by the way, I was never sent anyplace uncomfortable or dangerous. But I always bought into that comment that says, no inspection-ready unit has ever been combat-ready, and no combat-ready unit has ever been inspection-ready. Well, it turned out that despite the inspector's comments, the 118th Infantry had become a combat-ready unit during its year on the border, although they still needed some refinement. Many new members, many soldiers who had not been to the Mexican border are brought in and have to be trained up to standard. And we have a wonderful account, and again, I'm relying on Sam Royal's comments here. They begin training. One thing I prize in a historical writer is an appropriate sense of humor. They begin training for the World War after Congress's declaration of war. Now, all these guys had gotten home from the border and been happy to come back to their families, and perhaps not overjoyed to be called up again almost immediately. About the middle of July 1917, the regiment was assembled at Camp Sevier near Greenville, South Carolina, as the Pioneer Regiment of the 30th Division. Now, pioneers were a term for what we would today refer to as combat engineers, pioneer infantry, or pick and shovel men. The camp at that time consisted mostly of woods, cultivated fields, and mud. By the 1st of November, great improvements have been made in the camp. This regiment, having contributed more than its share of work in the cleaning up process, infantry might have been the official designation of the regiment. But the men insisted that it should be called the South Carolina Land and Development Company. So expert had they become with the use of the pick and shovel. Well, they were probably pick and shovel men already in many cases from their work at home, but in July of 1917, they haven't seen excavation yet, not until they get to the trenches of the First World War. Continuing, having started training when the regiment first reached Camp Sevier, the drills, hikes, trench work, and other forms of amusement continued through many weary, long months. Day after day, the men struggled through 8 hours of work, slowly but steadily progressing towards a standard that would mark them trained soldiers. Specialist schools were established in which the men and officers were taught the use of machine guns, automatic rifles, grenades, the bayonet, and all of the other modern weapons used by infantry in France. These schools were supervised by French and British officers, who selected the men showing special qualifications as their assistants. These assistants, in turn, acting as instructors throughout the regiment, thus enabling practically every man to become familiar with the use of one or more of these weapons. Now, notice he doesn't even mention the standard military arm, the bolt-action rifle, something with which the soldiers were already familiar and quite skilled. As we move with this regiment into the fighting on the Western Front, and I've called this little presentation today a half dozen heroes. Although it's more like half a dozen acknowledged heroes, men who received the Medal of Honor. But one of the things to understand about the 118th is its rather close connection with the history. These were men who very much identified with their grandfathers, or in some cases even fathers, who had fought in the 1860s. And the way that these men would go and serve gallantly, really represents in some ways a triumph of reconciliation. And this is an aspect that was on the public mind. It was mentioned, it was talked about, because the wounds of that war in the 1860s, in many ways, were healed by the sons of the Rebs and the Yanks and the freed slaves serving together on the same side, a theme we saw in our presentations on the Spanish-American War. And indeed, Robert Brown, whose things you can view in our collection, the supply officer of the 118th, whose stuff is on display at the Relic Room, which you can soon visit again in person. Well, he also left to us his grandfather's Confederate carbine from the 1860s. So it's worth considering. At the time, Norman Rockwell even did a visual piece showing a Union and Confederate veteran on either side of a doughboy and captioned it, "Blue plus gray equals khaki." And here we've got a view of men of the 118th in one of their training camps. And a good deal of high quality training is going to happen, both on this side of the ocean, and then when they feel like they're all ready, when they feel like they're all set and get over to France as highly trained soldiers, they find out that they're not considered highly trained soldiers by the men who are commanding or the men who are serving in World War I, which has been going on for years at that point. They're considered to be men with the potential to become trained soldiers and are again sent to instructional schools on the other side of the ocean to refine their skills. There's also a great note in here, again in Lieutenant Sam Royal's account after they got over to France. It was hard for us to realize that at last we were in France and less than 100 miles from the front line. Realization soon came, however, when we saw the damage that had been inflicted by aerial bombs and heard the hum of numerous planes overhead. The regiment remained a few days at the port of Calais, checking equipment, resting, and acquiring enough knowledge of the French language to show the proprietors of the cafes that we were not very ardent prohibitionists. Prohibition is, of course, a big issue going on back home in the United States at that time. One of the first things we learned was the French monetary system. But even now, we don't believe that 5 francs, 60 centimes, was ever equal to a good American dollar. The regiment left Calais and marched inward. It was while occupying this area that the men first experienced a few of the many discomforts of a war-ridden country. Barns for living quarters, rats, and the soldiers' of pet aversion, the famous cootie, appeared on the scene for the first time. This latter pest stuck to the regiment for many months, during which time it demonstrated its ability as the most rapid multiplier in the animal world. The rats furnished some good sport as targets for everything from a shoe to a rifle, but we did not deem them a necessity. Now, the 118th is going to have an interesting situation and distinction. And here you see a wartime postcard, rather sentimental in nature. You notice our doughboy in the middle is still wearing his campaign hat, something they're not actually going to wear in France. But that's okay, because the British soldier is wearing a dress kilt, and the French soldier, well, the French soldier is still wearing the bright red trousers that had been such a devastating bad uniform choice in the early years of the war. But the point of the picture, joining together with the Allies, it wasn't always quite so merry and cheerful as these 3 young soldiers that we see. We had to cooperate with our British and French allies. And one of General Pershing's struggles in World War I, he wanted to keep the American Expeditionary Force American and under American command. The British and the French, our allies, if they had their preferences, they didn't so much want our soldiers fighting as an American army in Europe, so much as they wanted our units integrated into their forces, but under their command and carrying out their strategies. This is something that Pershing, with President Wilson's backing, did not be cooperated with to a minimal extent. It was important to him that an American army under American command do things the American way. And that turned out to be very successful. But a senior commander like that is not just a general, but a diplomat. And so Pershing would make compromises, and some of his arrangements actually involved South Carolina troops. We'll do a session one day about South Carolina's segregated regiment in the First World War, the 371st Infantry. Well, those soldiers were put on loan to the French and served under French command. Meanwhile, the 118th Infantry, an all-white unit at that time from South Carolina, they also were put under the command of our allies. They would serve as part of a British corps, and over the division level, all of their officers are British officers making their decisions in the final big campaign of the war. Hence the title of that book, Borrowed Soldiers. The 30th Division, the Old Hickory Division as it's known, would actually fight under British command during the First World War. Now there were some good things about that. For instance, British artillery support, which was highly professional and well developed. While the United States had high quality infantry, and naturally South Carolina had high quality infantry, a boy who's grown up shooting at squirrels has got a leg up on his companions, and a boy who's grown up shooting at squirrels and raised on the stories of heroes of previous wars is even closer. But as far as artillery was concerned, the big guns, the American Army had avoided modernizing, and so arrived in France without any of its own artillery pieces. The American Army's artillery pieces were so obsolete that they were left behind, and the men were trained on secondhand French and British guns that they would man. But the infantry soldiers of the 30th Division, the infantry soldiers of the 118th Infantry in particular, one of the good things about serving under British command is they're going to receive highly professional fire support. And that's going to be very necessary because the situation that they move into on the front, the 118th Infantry is going to be crucial in the breaking of the last and strongest line of German defenses. Now, I'm not going to try to go into all of the nature of trench warfare in this little talk, but a very static form of war was going on in Europe. Heavily fortified forces not very far away from each other, striking back and forth across the open ground in between these trenches. And the trenches of different nations were constructed differently according to their military philosophy. For instance, for a long time, because the French soldier was supposed to be indoctrinated that only being on the offense was meaningful, that anything defensive was questionable courage-wise and foolish tactically, that only surging forward mattered. For that reason, French troops early in the war were forbidden to improve their trenches. They were supposed to pretend that any place they stopped behind a little protection was only temporary, that they were moving forward, always forward. And if they did anything to make their lives more comfortable or safer within their fortified trenches, this was taken as a bad sign. Well, and by the way, that's not universal. Of course, they had enormously fortified places like Verdun. But French trenches were built with that philosophy. The British were rather pragmatic, and the British trenches, the 30th Division moved into, they're going to find that they have wooden floors and other minor conveniences. I think of them as a comfortable campsite. But the Germans, Germans tend to be organizers and engineers. Culturally, it's a very strong thing. And when the Germans were settled into a trench line, literally for years, they improved it every day. They made it stronger, they made it better. And the Hindenburg line that the British were facing. This line of fortifications, this huge bunch of entrenchments. It included, by that last autumn of the war, the autumn of 1918, it included extensive tunnels to move troops from one direction to and one direction or another all along the defenses. Much was concrete. They actually had electrical power and just an enormous dug-in and fortified position, not the simple muddy ditch that we tend to picture with the First World War, but enormous and well-defended, very professional and very carefully laid out fortifications. They were thought to be impregnable. Most people were not believing that the First World War could end in the year of 1918. The bloodletting had been going on for years, and it was expected to go on for years to come. But something else had been going on at the same time. The British blockade had been devastating to the German economy, and the weakening of the German forces and the infusion of fresh forces from the United States who were ready to take the offensive was going to come together and prove that these very formidable defenses were, in a sense, hollow. And if the Hindenburg line could be broken, it's all broken field running after that. If the Hindenburg line could be broken, then the war would effectively be over. And the big push that would do this would happen in the autumn of 1918, and the troops right on the spearhead were South Carolinians, American troops under British command. The official report of the operations of the 30th Division gives the following description of the enemy's position. The position occupied by the enemy in front of the 30th Division was not only one of great strength, but possessed many unique features. Begun in 1914 and improved further in more recent periods, it formed one of the strongest positions of the famous Hindenburg system. In addition to the several heavy belts of wire and a very complete trench system, skillful advantage had been taken of the great natural obstacle of the St. Quentin Canal to make this position as nearly impregnable as was humanly possible. In addition to the canal and tunnel, this portion of the line included a system of trenches, generally 3, interlocked by communication and approach trenches, placed at frequent intervals. Wide belts of strong German wire protected the entire system. Forward belts were frequently in the form of deep triangles, 50 to 150 yards in depth. It is believed that there are few positions as well adapted for machine gun defense as the sector just described. And that machine gun defense is going to be very important in the individual stories of the half a dozen heroes whose records we will examine today. Because it will be the 30th Division that breaks the Hindenburg line. And again, breaking this Hindenburg line specifically at the St. Quentin Canal, there is a serious case to be made that that is the straw that breaks the camel's back, that is the pressure and the breakthrough that is going to result in the end of that terrible war. The 118th had the proud honor of having had more men receive the Medal of Honor than any regiment in the American Expeditionary Force, the following accounts of the official citations of the War Department. In every instance, these men were residents of the state of South Carolina, the state that gave origin to this famous regiment. Now, a word about the Medal of Honor itself. It had evolved quite a bit since the 1860s. for quite a while, the Medal of Honor was the only medal that the United States Army had. And so standards for awarding that medal in its early days varied quite widely. Some of the Union troops who received the Medal of Honor for an exploit in the 1860s would have received the Medal of Honor today for doing a similar thing. On the other hand, an entire unit near Washington, D.C. was awarded the Medal of Honor as a re-enlistment bonus. So it was awarded for a while from reasons all the way from incredibly heroic to relatively trivial. But in World War I, the standards for the honor had become pretty solid. They still varied a little bit among the services. The one South Carolinian in the Navy who received the Medal of Honor for his World War I service, he did something very heroic, but might perhaps receive the Sailor's Medal for it today. The enemy wasn't within 100 miles. He secured a dangerous loose torpedo at the risk of his life. But for the Army and the Marine Corps, the Medal of Honor standards had been established. And I think you're going to hear in the citations for these various men a little bit about what their what they were facing and how these men rose up to the challenge. And again, as a mental exercise and as a reminder that my own troubles aren't so big, reading Medal of Honor citations is often a useful exercise. So I did my best to find on fairly short notice photos of each of these men and succeeded with most of them. This one is Gary Evans Foster. Gary Evans Foster, Sergeant, Company F, 118th Infantry, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, above and beyond the call of duty with the enemy near Montbretagne, France, October 8, 1918. When his company was held up by violent machine gun fire from a sunken road, Sergeant Foster, with an officer, went forward to attack the hostile machine gun nests. The officer was wounded, but Sergeant Foster continued on alone in the face of heavy fire, and by effective use of hand grenades and his pistol, killed several of the enemy and captured 18. Home address, Inman, South Carolina. And you're going to find that machine gun positions are involved with these exploits. And to picture what it was like to crawl through the mud, to throw yourself forward, to get close enough to engage the enemy with hand weapons, to throw grenades, and to fire at short range with a Model 1911 pistol. It's a daunting idea, to say the least. Richmond Hilton. And that's an interesting first name, isn't it? Richmond. Richmond Hobson Hilton, Sergeant, Company M, 118th Infantry. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty in action with the enemy at Brancourt, France, October 11th, 1918. While Sergeant Hilton's company was advancing through the village of Rancourt, it was held up by intense enfilading fire from a machine gun. Discovering that this fire came from a machine gun nest among shell holes at the edge of the town, Sergeant Hilton, accompanied by a few other soldiers, but well in advance of them, pressed on toward this position, firing with his rifle until his ammunition was exhausted, and then with his pistol, killing 6 of the enemy, capturing 10. In the course of this daring exploit, he received a wound from a bursting shell, which resulted in the loss of his arm. Home address, Westville, South Carolina. Now, the briefest of asides, Richard Hobson Hilton apparently received his name in honor of another Medal of Honor winner. He had been named after a Medal of Honor winner, Richmond P. Hobson. And Richmond T. Hobson had received the Medal of Honor for his part in the Spanish-American War, in temporary command of the collier Merrimack. And Richard Hobson, after dining with President William McKinley, Hobson traveled west by train to San Francisco in the Philippines. Crowds greeted his train at many stations, and his enthusiasm for kissing admiring young women made him a symbol. He became a sort of celebrity during the rise of popular journalism and was referred to as the most kissed man in America. So Richmond Hilton's father named him after the most kissed man in America. I don't know if he hoped his son would attain to that distinction, but he also named him after a Medal of Honor winner, and Richmond Hilton would himself become a recipient of the Medal of Honor. And excuse me for getting lighthearted during a tribute, but I had to share that particular detail. Thomas Lee Hall, deceased. Sergeant, Company G, 118th Infantry, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty in action with the enemy near Montbrehon, France, October 8, 1918. Having overcome 2 machine gun nests under his skillful leadership, Sergeant Hall's platoon was stopped 800 yards from its final objective by machine gun fire of particular intensity. Ordering his men to take cover in a sunken road, he advanced alone on the enemy machine gun post and killed 5 members of the crew with his bayonet, thereby made possible the further advance of the line. While attacking another machine gun nest later in the day, this gallant soldier was mortally wounded. Home address, Fort Mill, South Carolina. And while pictures exist of Thomas Lee Hall, I was unable to find one I could adapt for this presentation. John C. Villapig, Corporal, Company M, 118th Infantry. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty in action with the enemy at Vaux-en-Digny, France, October 15th, 1918. These men probably couldn't pronounce French either, so I hope they'll forgive me. Having been sent out with 2 other soldiers to scout through the village of Vaux-en-Digny, he met with strong resistance from enemy machine gun fire, which killed one of his men and wounded the other. Continuing his advance without aid, 500 yards in advance of his platoon and in the face of machine gun and artillery fire, he encountered 4 of the enemy in a dugout, whom he attacked and killed with a hand grenade. Crawling forward to a point 150 yards in advance of his first encounter, he rushed a machine gun nest, killing 4 and capturing 6 of the enemy and taking 2 light machine guns. After being joined by his platoon, he was severely wounded in the arm. Home address, Camden, South Carolina. James Harriet. When you come and see our museum for real, you'll have the opportunity to see on display the Medal of Honor that was awarded to the family of James Harriet. James D. Harriet, deceased. Corporal, Company I, 118th Infantry. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty in action with the enemy at Vaux-en-Digny, France, October 11th, 1918. Corporal Harriet, with 4 other soldiers, organized a combat group and attacked an enemy machine gun nest which had been inflicting heavy casualties on the company. In the advance, 2 of his men were killed, and because of the heavy fire from all sides, the remaining 2 sought shelter. Unmindful of the hazard attached to the mission, Corporal Harriet, with fixed bayonet alone, charged the machine gun, making his way through the fire for a distance of 30 yards and forcing the enemy to surrender. During this exploit, he received several wounds in the arm and later in the same day, while charging another nest, he was killed. Home address, Providence, South Carolina. And James Dozier, the only officer in this group to be awarded the Medal of Honor, would have a distinguished career and a military career in South Carolina long after the war in which he received his award. James C. Dozier, First Lieutenant, Company G, 118th Infantry, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty in action with the enemy near Montbrehon, France, October 8th, 1918. All 6 of these 118th Medals of Honor happened within a few days of each other, and 3 of them happened on that dark day of October 8th, 1918. In command of 2 platoons, Lieutenant Dozier was painfully wounded in the shoulder early in the attack, but continued to lead his men, displaying the highest bravery and skill. When his command was held up by heavy machine gun fire, he disposed his men in the best cover available and, with a soldier, continued forward to attack a machine gun nest. Creeping up to the position in the face of intense fire, he killed the entire crew with hand grenades and his pistol, and a little later captured a number of Germans who had taken refuge in a dugout nearby. In addition to the Medal of Honor, Lieutenant Dozier was awarded the British Military Cross by the British government. Well, a few years ago, I had the distinct privilege of bringing some young cadets to meet recipients of the Medal of Honor at their annual convention, a convention that was held that year at Patriots Point Museum on the old aircraft carrier, the Yorktown. And 2 things that I noted. They don't like to be called winners of the Medal of Honor. They don't feel like it was something that was won. They seem to have a consensus among themselves. These men will tell you, I accepted the Medal of Honor because there were lots of other men who deserved it more and nobody saw them. It's not something that distinguishes me individually. I accept it on behalf of comrades. So that was something that these men would consistently say, no matter how impressive the feat was that you could read about in what they had done. But the other thing that you noticed was that they remained, those who survived the exploit for which the Medal of Honor was awarded, they tend to remain very active in doing things for their community, in doing things for others, in selfless service of one sort or another. And James Dozier would eventually, by the time South Carolina National Guard are training for the Second World War, this is the Adjutant General of the state who is in charge of bringing them up to a combat standard in the new war, and who knows very much what that combat standard implies. By that time, he was known in the state as Mr. National Guard. And if you visit National Guard bases around South Carolina, you're going to see the name Dozier here and there. You're going to see it on buildings. You're going to see the portrait. He's a man who's very much remembered. Now, all 6 of these men are part of the South Carolina National Guard tradition. But this is the guy who went on as elected Adjutant General of the state for years to be Mr. National Guard. But one of my favorite stories about Dozier I find in the National Guard history in the 1930s, after he had risen to be Adjutant General of the state. Because recall what I just told you, much like the non-commissioned officers listed who got the Medal of Honor, when Dozier found his 2 platoons of men held up by heavy machine gun fire, their commanding officer He didn't say, Sergeant, take a squad and take care of that machine gun. He didn't pick the bravest or the craziest or the most athletic man out of his men and say, we need somebody to go in there and take care of it personally. He didn't say, send a detail to flank that machine gun. He picked out one guy and he said, okay, follow me. We're taking care of it. And went up there with a hand weapon, with a pistol and grenades, and took the machine gun nest himself. A combat leader who told his combat troops, you shelter here, I'll take care of it. In the 1930s, there was a situation at the penitentiary in Colombia. A group of prisoners had taken hostages. There was a riot going on, and they called out the National Guard. Members of the same unit, but of course these are younger men, not guys who had seen combat in World War I. Members of the National Guard are called out. They're in their gear. They're around the penitentiary. And who shows up but the Adjutant General of the entire state? And there are the troops ready to go in and do something about the riot in the penitentiary. And the Adjutant General of the state, James Dozier, says, oh, tell me what's going on here. They explained it to him. James Dozier turns to a constable, a police constable. He gets a pistol and some hand grenades, and he tells the constable, follow me, we'll take care of it. Leaves the troops outside the penitentiary, goes in himself, and with tear gas grenades and his pistol, solves the situation. None of the hostages get hurt. One or two of the prisoners get shot. The account doesn't make that very clear. I hope to research more detail on that one day. But he goes in there, shoots the bad guys by himself, and comes back, and just as he had done in World War I, comes back to the troops he commands and says, okay, I handled it. You aren't going to need to go in. So I find it very believable that this man was as revered as he was. And I seem to be coming in under time, which is nice. Folks, the story of the 118th Infantry in World War I is one that I think very much needs to be remembered. And so I'll wrap up with a tribute. The official correspondent of the Australian forces in France wrote this. And that makes it a special tribute. The Australians were right with the South Carolinians of the 30th Division. They fought together. They fought over the same objectives. In fact, when we had an exhibit at the 90-year anniversary on South Carolina's role in the Great War, it so happened that an Australian lieutenant colonel, he was a lieutenant colonel, and he was visiting Fort Jackson and stopped by the museum and was a great military history enthusiast. We had a wonderful talk. But he did want to lecture me that our exhibit about South Carolinians was not giving nearly enough credit to the Australians. There was a little bit of rivalry between those two units and a little bit of criticism from the Australians that the Americans were new to the game and kept doing things that were rash. So a compliment from that direction was a particularly good one. Someday, when the full story of this battle can be told, the American people will thrill with pride in these magnificent troops, upon whom a tremendous task fell. They were faced by the most formidable task that could be imposed upon them, the breaking of two double systems of the greatest defense line the Germans ever constructed. On the left of their attack, there was some uncertainty regarding the situation, and this increased the difficulty of their work. Yet these troops, working under the enthusiasm of their high ideal, carried through their assaults, penetrated deeper even than had been intended, and delivered a blow which attracted the greatest part of the enemy's resistance. Beyond all question, they made it possible to break the defensive line in a position of the utmost importance to the Allied cause. Now, by the time the breaking of the Hindenburg line tipped the balance and ensured the end of that bloody and confused struggle that was the Great War. Even the Germans were going to be relieved that the whole mess was finally over. And if there were men whose effective fighting and valor succeeded in achieving the objective of ending that war, those men were certainly the South Carolinians of the 118th Infantry. So thank you all today for dropping in on this talk and hearing about the exploits of these brave men. And going to give a second for any chat questions that might come across. I might or might not be able to answer those chat questions, but thank you all very much for your attention today, and I do hope to see you at the South Carolina Confederate Relic Room and Military Museum before very long, where you can interact up close with some of these artifacts of a distinguished regiment from the Old Hickory Division.